Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Islam's Golden Age, Rise of the Abbasids by Epic History TV. This is a new video by Epic History TV, and we're doing a bit of Islamic history. Now on this channel we've done a fair amount on the Rashidun and the Umayyad Caliphates, but we haven't yet covered the Abbasids, so I'm very excited to get into this video. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this one, I would appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below and will give you access to exclusive reaction content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this video.
In the 8th century Middle East, a new dynasty seized control of one of the world's greatest empires, the Islamic Caliphate. Though little remembered in the West today, the Abbasids reigned for 5 centuries.
Ooh.
They oversaw an era of Islamic military dominance, city building, brilliant scholarship, and technological innovation.
I'm excited to see because, like I said, we've done some videos on the Rashidun and Umayyad Caliphates, and we saw the rapid expansion of the early caliphate. It seized a lot of territory, but what I do know is that in those following centuries, it would grow even larger, even more prosperous, develop culturally, enter into this so-called Golden Age. And so I'm excited to see sort of how that change began with the Abbasids.
It has come to be remembered as Islam's Golden Age. This is the story of the Abbasid Caliphate.
Alright, part 1, Rise of the Abbasids, however you want to pronounce it.
632 AD. In the Arabian city of Medina, the Prophet Muhammad lies dead. His followers, professing the new religion of Islam, sweep across the Arabian Peninsula, uniting it under the rule of Abu Bakr, the first caliph.
Yes, a truly skilled general. There are a lot of figures in this early Islamic history who are pretty impressive characters, and Abu Bakr is certainly one of them.
God's deputy on earth. Then they burst upon the world stage, taking on the 2 superpowers of the Middle East, the Eastern Roman and Sassanid empires. Both are vulnerable after decades of war.
Yeah, and when they say vulnerable after decades of war, we're talking about war between these powers. The Eastern Roman Empire and the Sassanid Empire had basically beaten each other into submission. The Sassanids had the upper hand, and then the Romans under Heraclius managed to retaliate, fight back. In the end, both empires were left extremely weakened, and then at the same time you see the emergence of the Caliphate, and in a series of really key battles, including Yarmouk and Al-Qadisiyah, which are being shown on screen right now, the Caliphate managed to rapidly expand into Persian and Roman territory, and in fact, the Sassanid Persian Empire is not going to survive the emergence of the Caliphate.
And the Muslims wage a stunning campaign, winning victory after victory. By 651, they have overrun 2/3 of the Eastern Roman Empire and almost all of the Sassanid Empire.
Yep, they completely destroyed the Sassanid Empire and took a massive amount of Roman territory. I mean, we're talking about the Eastern Roman Empire. It'll have a lot of ups and downs, but this was a serious challenge to the territorial integrity of the entire empire. I mean, you can see how much land the Romans have just lost.
But in 656, the 3rd Caliph, Uthman, is assassinated, sparking the first Muslim civil war, or fitna.
Yeah, and we see there's an era of the early unified caliphate, and then it descends into a lot of civil strife, chaos, several fitnas, aka civil wars. Eventually, everything will reunify again, but there is a period of chaos.
Ali, cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, has the support of the people. But he's opposed by the governor of Syria, Uthman's kinsman, Muawiyah. 5 years of bloodshed culminate in Ali's assassination at Kufa.
And it's around, by the way, some of these political issues, not just this, but some of these political issues that we see the development of the Islamic schism, Sunni versus Shia. A lot of it emerges from the political disagreements of this time, but these political disagreements will eventually become religious differences.
Muawiyah emerges triumphant and establishes a new Umayyad caliphate. Further conquests help to forge one of the largest empires in history. But it is riven by more civil war. One challenge comes from Hussein, son of Ali, grandson of the Prophet Muhammad. He opposes the succession of Muawiyah's son, Yazid. But in 680, he and his followers are defeated and killed at the Battle of Karbala.
Yep, and when we talk about that Islamic schism, this is sort of an important event in terms of that.
Supporters of Ali and his descendants will later become the Shiites.
Right.
They still commemorate Hussein's death each year on the day of Ashura. The vast Umayyad Caliphate continues to expand.
And this, by the way, is basically where we've gotten to in our early Muslim expansion series. We saw how the Caliphate expanded into Iberia, into Spain. And so from this point onwards, we're in sort of new territory. And I'm excited to learn some stuff that I may not be so familiar with.
But it contains serious internal divisions. Much of what we know about the Umayyad Caliphate comes from later sources, often hostile. But it seems clear that the small Arab Muslim elite that dominated this great empire was increasingly unpopular with many of its subjects.
Yeah, this is absolutely crucial. We see this in the Umayyad Caliphate, and some of that civil strife and some of those fitnas have something to do with that sort of inequality, that separation. We have this Arab-Muslim elite. And then, of course, you have non-Muslims within the empire. Of course, there are a lot of Christians, a lot of Jews, people of other religious groups, because remember, this is pretty newly conquered territory. A lot of it used to be Roman or Persian, and so there are still a lot of non-Muslims who feel they're being treated as second-class citizens, because they are. And then we also have a lot of converts, right? People who have converted to Islam, but may not be Arab. They may be from one of these other ethnic groups, people groups, throughout the very diverse caliphate. And there are a lot of instances when these Muslims feel like they're not being treated fairly. They feel like, well, I've converted to Islam, I am as equal as any other Muslim, but they feel they're not being treated equally to these Arab Muslims. And so they feel like they're being treated as second-class citizens. And so this creates a lot of tension, inequality, a lot of political chaos at the time.
Including some of those later termed dhimmi. These were non-Muslims, including Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians, who were treated as an underclass and made to pay extra tax. Even those who did convert to Islam, known as Mawali, were often treated as second-class subjects. Decades of discontent were about to boil over. The symbol of Umayyad authority was their white banner. But in 747, a new symbol rises to challenge their rule. The black banners of the Abbasids. If you think you could do a better job building a caliphate or leading a medieval kingdom to glory, Crusader King...
Alright, I'm gonna say, make sure to check out this video by Epic History TV. Make sure to check out their sponsor, leave them a like. I'll have their video linked in the description below. We want to show them support for making these fantastic videos. I really enjoy their content, and we want to show them all the support we can. So I'm going to let this ad play through. I'm going to talk over it. Little disclaimer, I mentioned this in the last video, I'm a little sick right now, so if I have to clear my throat or if my voice sounds a little weird, that's why. I'm a little sick right now, but I'm trying to get these reactions out for you guys, because I enjoy them, and I think this is going to be an interesting video. So anyway, we'll let this ad play through, and then we'll get back to the history.
Is free to play on Steam between the 11th and the 15th of May, so it's the perfect time to try out this richly rewarding medieval strategy game. Use our link in the video description and on screen now to get building your dynasty. Thanks to Crusader Kings
Use their
3
link
for supporting this video.
The Abbasid Revolution, okay.
The Abbasids are an Arab family, descended from the Prophet Muhammad's uncle Al-Abbas, from whom they take their name. They and their supporters believe this blood tie to the Prophet gives them legitimate claim to the title of Caliph. Far more so than the Umayyads, whom the Abbasids later portray as decadent and despised. The Abbasids promise a return to true Islam, to correct teachings and moral leadership, and send missionaries and agents out across the Caliphate to spread their message.
And, this has been a big part of these early Muslim debates over who should be caliph, who should be in charge. There's been a strong faction, and we talk about the Sunni-Shia split, who has been very pro those who are related to Muhammad. They think that means you are qualified or you are legitimate in terms of leading the caliphate because you have that blood relation to Muhammad. There are others that think the decision should be made differently, but that familial relationship to Muhammad does mean a lot to a lot of people.
In 747, with the Caliphate once more racked by revolt and civil war, the Abbasids will seize their chance. In eastern Khurasan, a general named Abu Muslim, probably a Persian convert, launches a revolt and takes the black banner of the Hashemites as his symbol. The Hashemites, descendants of Hashim, are the extended family of the Prophet, with the Abbasids prominent amongst them. This frontier region, today comprising northeastern Iran and parts of Turkmenistan and Afghanistan, is particularly ripe for rebellion. Here, Arabs and non-Arab converts live side by side. They intermarry and fight alongside each other to defend the frontier. For many, the Umayyads are distant and unpopular overlords.
Right, and so we return to that idea of, look, if I've converted to Islam, we should all be equal under the eyes of Allah. And so it shouldn't matter what ethnic group I come from. We're all Muslims. And in this case, we look at the extent of the caliphate. Sure, in some regions of the empire, it's predominantly Arabs, but in other regions, there are a lot of other people groups. There are a lot of Persians, for example, and they're living side by side with their fellow Muslims, Arab Muslims, Persian Muslims, a lot of other groups. And so to them, not only is this Umayyad political authority distant, but they may feel that they're being treated unfairly when in their eyes they're perfectly equal to any other Muslim, whether they be Arab or any other people group. And so a lot of these revolts or civil wars or any of this political strife can emerge from some of this dissatisfaction that some of these non-Arab groups feel with how they're treated.
What's more, opposition has been stoked for decades by Hashemite agents and missionaries who seek to topple the Umayyads and replace them with one of their own. They have sowed the seeds of revolution. So when Abu Muslim begins his revolt, he quickly attracts followers, Arabs, Persians, and Central Asians, many of whom are experienced warriors. and he proves a brilliant commander, winning a series of victories over Umayyad forces and occupying Kufa, capital of Iraq, in 749.
Wow.
The Abbasids now assume leadership of this revolution. And the following year, their forces meet the army of the Umayyad Caliph, Marwan II, at the Zab River. Most of what we know about the battle that follows comes from Abbasid sources.
So, of course, we have to be careful when we're looking at our sources. From any period in history, we have to be careful to look at, all right, who is writing this? What audience are they writing for? What biases might they have? And so if we're looking at a battle between the Umayyads and the Abbasids, and we only have Abbasid sources, then of course we're aware of which direction the bias is. So we have to take that into account, but we've got to use the sources we have.
Caliph Marwan appears to have been a brave but reckless commander, launching a head-on cavalry charge against the Abbasid line. Abbasid historians tell how their own troops, inspired by recent victories, stand fast. Their spear walls repel the cavalry. The attack ends in disaster. Umayyad morale is broken, their army routed. Marwan himself flees the battle, but is pursued and killed in Egypt.
Wow.
Other Umayyads are likewise hunted down and exterminated. Even graves are desecrated. One surviving member of the dynasty, Abd al-Rahman, flees to Spain. Just a few years later, he establishes the Emirate of Cordoba, a second Umayyad dynasty that would flourish in Iberia for centuries.
Fascinating. Okay. That's very interesting. You know, I don't know too much about Muslim history, but we look at the Islamic world. At times it's more unified, at times it's very split up. And so we see a sort of independent emirate being formed, but an Umayyad emirate in Iberia. So that's a real fascinating change. Because, you know, it's only a couple of decades before this point, we're at 750 AD, only a few decades before had the caliphate even expanded into the Iberian Peninsula for the first time. So it's sort of interesting to see that political change.
Meanwhile, Abul Abbas al-Safar becomes the first Abbasid caliph, though it will take the Abbasids more than a decade to consolidate their hold on power. Al-Safar moves the caliph's residence from Haran to Kufa, closer to the Abbasid power base in Persia. In 751, he sends an army to curb the westward expansion of the Chinese Tang dynasty. The campaign culminates in a bloody victory at the Battle of Talas.
Yep, and we have done a reaction to the Battle of Talas, a real interesting one. We see the interaction between a Chinese empire and a Muslim caliphate. You often think of these two powers very separately. You know, it's pretty amazing to think that a Chinese empire went so far west and a Muslim caliphate so far east that the two would interact with each other, but they did, and they fought for domination over this territory. A real interesting point in history.
But also marks the limit of the caliphate's eastward expansion.
Right.
Many who'd helped overthrow the Umayyads had sought the end of hereditary rule and a return to caliphs elected from within an elite group. They are to be...
And this is how we saw a lot of these caliphs chosen initially. We had this very small council that would choose who the next caliph would be.
Disappointed. In 754, Al-Safar is succeeded by his brother, Al-Mansur.
But a lot of times with these big, powerful empires, you know, maybe you have a democratic system, maybe you have a council-based system. A lot of times with these big empires, when we see someone powerful taking control, they then make it hereditary. They want to put their own family in charge.
The Abbasids will be the new ruling dynasty, and Al-Mansur will prove one of its greatest caliphs.
Okay.
But his reign begins inauspiciously with the execution of the brilliant and popular General Abu Muslim, now regarded as a potentially dangerous rival. Al-Mansur faces rebellion by the Alids, a powerful clan descended from the Prophet's son-in-law, Ali.
Right, and, we talked about how that familial relationship to Muhammad is so important. And so you can sort of see how that's manifesting in a lot of these different groups and factions.
Present the growing dynastic power of the Abbasids and press their own claim to rule. Al-Mansur crushes the last major Alid revolt in 762, ushering in an era of stability, prosperity, and peace. That year, he orders the construction of a new capital on the banks of the Tigris River. Officially, it is to be known as Madinat as-Salam, the City of Peace. It will prove his greatest legacy, a city that will become one of the glories of the medieval world. Baghdad.
Yeah, and like they said, one of the glories of the medieval world, Baghdad, will become, both in the Islamic world, but also just the medieval world as a whole, a center of wealth, trade, philosophy, science, literature, culture, all these different things. We talk about the Islamic Golden Age, and one of the first places we turn to is Baghdad. It really is a center of this Islamic Golden Age, and like I said, a center of culture even more broadly than that.
In the reign of Al-Mansur's grandson, Harun al-Rashid, the caliphate flourishes as never before, with Baghdad at its heart. There are many legends told about Caliph Harun al-Rashid, the rightly guided. He is, after all, a central figure in 1001 Nights, the masterpiece of Arabic literature.
Right, and this is what I mean when I say, we see all of this really important culture, literature, arts, sciences in terms of the Islamic world, but also beyond. 1001 Nights, this is known not just in the Muslim world, not just in the Arab world, but the entire world. So you can sort of see the cultural influence of a lot of these things.
The image of al-Rashid that reaches us from such sources is of a devout, wise, and beneficent ruler who prayed 100 times a day and each morning gave 1,000 dirhams to good causes. In legend, al-Rashid wandered the streets of Baghdad disguised as a beggar to see how his subjects lived. He was a brilliant horseman and patron of the arts, and a keen chess player. His court was a place where religion and philosophy could be argued and debated openly, even, on occasion, by a woman.
Yes, and we saw a lot of this in our reactions to the Islamic Golden Age videos by kings and generals. It's really interesting. Before this point, we see, like I've said, the expansion of the caliphate very rapidly. This strong military power that takes on the Persians, the Romans, defeats them both handily, and conquers a lot of that territory. But only now. There's been a much longer period of conquest. Things are starting to settle down a little bit. Do we reach the prosperity, culture, arts of a more settled empire? And we see this with a lot of empires. They have rapid expansion. If the empire manages to survive, when you reach a more stable and peaceful period, then everybody starts saying, hey, why don't we do literature and arts and sciences? And that's what we see flourishing here. We see, of course, a lot of theology, a lot of study of religion, but as well, both attached to that and separately, we see a lot of other philosophy, we see a lot of other literature, a lot of other science. A lot of that is related to other types of cultures. A lot of this Islamic philosophy draws from many different traditions. We see them taking from Indian ideas, Indian practices, ancient Greek practices, a variety of different traditions are brought into the Islamic world. It's a really interesting confluence of different ideas under this sort of Islamic umbrella.
In the Caliphate, as in the rest of the medieval world, few women held high status in their own right. But as mothers, wives and concubines, they could exert huge influence. Al-Khazuran, once a Yemeni slave girl, rose from concubine to caliph's wife, and wielded significant power during the reign of her husband, Caliph al-Mahdi, and son, Caliph al-Rashid. Famed for her intelligence and learning, she held discussions on policy and military strategy, received foreign ambassadors, and intervened on questions of justice. Much of her own enormous wealth she spent on public works and charity. Many likened her to a co-ruler, or even the real caliph.
Yeah, and like they said, throughout the medieval world, typically it was more difficult for women to gain positions of prominence in public life. Of course, it ranged a bit from culture to culture, but generally that was the case. And so it is really remarkable to see a woman manage to take that position. Now, of course, we have examples of women like this throughout history. They usually can't necessarily take the most direct route. Oftentimes it's, the ruler behind the ruler, pulling the strings from the background. But, we have examples, and this is one of them, of a woman who really held a lot of influence over a fairly long period of time and was able to use her influence to accomplish goals.
The success of al-Rashid's reign was underpinned by efficient government and administration. Much of it was modelled on that of their predecessors, the Sassanids. And they...
Yep, this is a extremely key point. And I've talked about this a lot of times, both in our videos on Islamic history and our videos on Persian history, right? So, we see the Caliphate expands, it conquers a lot of Roman territory, it completely conquers the Sassanid Persian Empire. I mean, the Persian Empire is gone after that. But because of this long-standing Persian style of governance, this long-standing Persian tradition and culture, it survives the takeover of the Caliphate. Now, some elements of Persian culture do disappear, like Zoroastrianism is basically taken over by Islam. If you look at Iran today, it is vast majority a Muslim country. There aren't too many Zoroastrians left, but a lot of these aspects of Persian culture do survive. And one really important aspect of Persian tradition that survives is the style of bureaucracy and governance that these Persian empires had been using for hundreds and hundreds of years, and that when the Caliphate arrived, it basically looked at this style of bureaucracy and governance and said, you know what, why don't we just do that? It was effective, it's worked before, let's just do the same thing. And so they adopted that way of doing things, but within the Caliphate.
They made extensive use of Persian and Central Asian bureaucrats. Of particular note was the Barmakid family. The Barmakids were descended from high priests of the Buddhist temple of Nobahar, near Balkh, in modern Afghanistan. As early Abbasid allies, they played an important role in government, helping to foster an age of Islamic statecraft, imbued with elements of Sasanian Persian culture. They served the Abbasids well for 3 generations, but the power games of court could be dangerous and unpredictable. In 803, Al-Rashid decided the Barmakids had got a little too big for their boots. The family experienced a sudden and dramatic fall from favour, with many of its members imprisoned or executed.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's how it can go. Like they said, these games of court intrigue and bureaucracy, these are dangerous. And if you slip up, or even if someone more powerful than you decides, you know what, they're getting a little too big for their britches, then you could be in a lot of trouble. This is just how the court culture of, whether we're talking about the Persian Empire or the Eastern Roman Empire, or now the Caliphate, that's just how these court cultures worked.
Their demise ended Barmakid control of the post of vizier, a position that had recently emerged at court as the Caliph's senior advisor and chief minister.
Yes, and a position that will remain very important throughout the Islamic world beyond the Caliphate for hundreds and hundreds of years.
It was a role of enormous significance. Some viziers would later wield so much power they overshadowed the Caliph himself.
Yeah.
The fame of Al-Rashid's court spread far and wide. Charlemagne, king of the Franks, Holy Roman Emperor, and the most powerful ruler in Europe, sent several embassies to Baghdad. In return, Al-Rashid sent him dazzling gifts, including perfume, ivory chessboards, a marvelous water clock, and even an elephant named Abu Abbas, which lived for several years at Charlemagne's court in Aachen.
And you gotta remember, we're talking about the trek from basically northern France to the Middle East. That would have been a long journey at the time. Long and potentially dangerous at points. I'm always surprised that the elephant managed to make it back and live for years longer. You also gotta remember that this is Charlemagne. This tells us a couple of things, right? It shows us the prominence of the Abbasid Caliphate, shows us how wide their name has reached, how important they are, how well known they are. This also tells us a little bit about Charlemagne. This is him sort of playing politics. You know, he is trying to secure his own ascendancy. This is him, in some ways, playing games with the Eastern Roman Empire. Because there was a bit of tension between Charlemagne and the Eastern Romans. I mean, they're both claiming to be the Roman Empire, the legitimate representation of the Roman Empire. So this is Charlemagne saying, I can do international politics, let me talk to the Caliphate and we can establish a friendly relationship, especially because the Caliphate is far away from me. I don't have to worry about it too much, but the Caliphate is right on the doorstep of the Eastern Roman Empire, and Eastern Rome has been severely threatened in the past by this political entity. So, like I said, this tells you a couple of things. It shows you the sort of ascendancy of the Abbasid Caliphate, how important it's become. It also tells you a little bit about the international politics of the era.
Cultural life in the Caliphate, and Baghdad in particular, was remarkably cosmopolitan. The Abbasid court even celebrated Persian holidays, such as Nowruz, Persian New Year. Such open-mindedness helped the Caliphate to flourish as a center of culture, science, arts, and medicine.
Yeah, and this is what I was saying earlier about how this flourishing of culture, arts, science, literature included a lot of other cultural traditions. Because there was that sort of open-minded spirit, like I said, they took a lot of literature, philosophy, science from, for example, ancient Grecian thinkers and adapted it into their own works. And actually, a lot of ancient Greek works were only preserved because the Muslim world translated them into Arabic and held them until Europe became a little more interested in them. You know, fast forward to the Renaissance and the Scientific Revolution. They took ideas from other sources as well. I mentioned India. You know, of course, that's a big influence as well. But, you know, we really see this cosmopolitan court a lot of ideas coming from a lot of different places and merging together. A lot of ideas from just within the caliphate itself. We see a lot of Persian ideas, culture, traditions, as they mentioned, were still being observed.
The center of learning was the city's famous library, Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, though little of its function is known today. Here and across the Caliphate, scholars translated classical works from Greek, Middle Persian and Sanskrit into Arabic. Their efforts in
Greek, Middle Persian, and Sanskrit. Basically the three influences I mentioned.
ensured the survival of countless works that would otherwise have been lost,
Yep.
including those by great figures such as Aristotle and Galen. They also made many of their own original discoveries, knowledge that would come to be much sought after by the medieval West.
Yes, very true. And it's interesting to see this sort of cycle of influence. You know, the Arab world, or the Muslim world, I should say, because, of course, it's much broader than just the Arab world. The Muslim world takes influence, Sanskrit sources, Greek sources, Persian sources, and they develop their own ideas using some of these sources, their own original ideas, and then, so, you know, you have a cycle of influence, Greek to Islamic, and then the Islamic world develops its own literature, science, philosophy, and you go to the Western world, and they say, hey, can we get a look at some of that medicine and science? And so, the cycle continues. I just think it's interesting to see all these different cultures interacting. Also looking at, who is ascendant at that time. Of course, you go back, I mean, at this point, if we're in 1200, go back about a century, and we can see, a more powerful Roman world and Greek world, and they're doing a lot of philosophy and science. But at this point, medieval Europe in many ways is sort of struggling, a lot of squabbling states, struggling to fight each other and centralize power, and the Islamic world is more unified, and so it has the money to put towards these pursuits, and then they can share them with everybody else. So it's just interesting to see.
Baghdad's scholars led the world in many fields. Al-Kindi, known as the philosopher of the Arabs, was a famed polymath who wrote on logic, psychology, astronomy, astrology, and many other topics. Al-Khwarizmi's contribution to mathematics led to him being dubbed the father of algebra. The Latinized version of his name, Algoritmus, is the origin of our word algorithm.
Yep.
The Christian scholar Hunayn ibn Ishaq was nicknamed the Sheikh of Translators for his role translating ancient texts into Arabic. Material culture also flourished under the Abbasids, with the introduction of glazed pottery in the 9th century, allowing new artistic possibilities. Many colourful pieces, decorated with animals and Kufic lettering, have been discovered across the former caliphate from this period. The Abbasid Caliphate also benefited from its position astride the Silk Roads.
Yes, and so now, this position in the world is an important position. You talk about, say, connecting East and West. It's sort of broad, East and West. Okay, how far east and how far west? And where exactly is the center point? Well, you can see on this map, there's a lot of center points. Constantinople is one of those center points. Now, the Caliphate takes one of those center points. It used to be the Persians, but now the Caliphate really controls a lot of this trade going from west to east and from east to west. They can benefit from a lot of this trade. Of course, it's not only goods that are being exchanged, but ideas, philosophy that's being exchanged. And now that the Caliphate is in that position, they can benefit from that.
The name for the ancient network of trade routes linking Europe and Asia. Valuable imports travelled along this route, such as silk, spices, ivory, gemstones, and even thoroughbred horses.
Wow.
To encourage this trade, the Abbasids built new roads, as well as inns, hospices, and wells for the comfort of travelers.
And to do that, that you've got at this point, you've got a big, powerful empire. You think of the Roman Empire at its height. What was it doing? It was building a lot of infrastructure, a lot of roads. At this point, it's been a long, long time since the Roman Empire has been able to upkeep a lot of those ancient Roman roads. We see the emergence of a new, powerful empire. They get right on infrastructure. They do a lot of cartography as well, mapping. They map their territory, they build infrastructure, build roads, inns. Just the sign of a big, powerful, resource-rich empire.
New ideas and technology also flowed along the Silk Roads. Chinese paper-making techniques first reached the Muslim world under the Umayyads. But it was under the Abbasids that paper production really took off. Much cheaper than parchment or papyri, abundant supplies of paper transformed the practice of administration and bookmaking, and helped medieval Islam to become one of the most bookish cultures in world history.
And like I mentioned earlier, you see this interaction of different cultures. Sometimes it's a cycle, like, Greek ideas, Greeks and Romans influence the Islamic world, then the Islamic world influences the West. Sometimes it's more of a line. A lot of different technologies and ideas come from the East, primarily from India and China. They come to the Islamic world, and then the Islamic world exports them westwards into Europe. You see all these different cultures and their ideas and technologies interacting.
In the 7th century, the first Arab conquests had pushed the frontier of the Eastern Roman Empire back to the Taurus Mountains.
Yeah.
Since then, the Caliphate and Empire had been in a state of almost perpetual war, with frequent raids by both sides across the Syrian frontier. Twice, the Arabs had even besieged Constantinople itself, but failed to take the great city.
And that was really the key, the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire was Constantinople. As long as Constantinople stood, then the Roman Empire stood. If Constantinople was to fall, it would all be over. But it just so happened that Constantinople is a very defensible city. The defenses are strong, and so it had been besieged and will be besieged many times, but until the end, of course, it managed to withstand a lot of battering, a lot of attacks over the years.
In 782, al-Rashid himself had led an Abbasid force as far as the shores of the Bosphorus. By 804, the Eastern Roman Empire was paying annual tribute to the Caliphate. When Emperor Nikephoros stopped the payments, an Abbasid army crossed the Taurus Mountains and took his army by surprise at Knossos. The Romans suffered a heavy defeat. The emperor himself was lucky to escape with his life. The cycle of raid and counter-raid continued for years, with al-Rashid even moving the Abbasid capital to Raqqa to be closer to the frontier.
Wow.
But this fixation on his rival to the west may have blinded the Caliph to trouble in the east.
Yeah, and you can sort of understand why. The Roman Empire has this rich history, very impressive, and so to conquer the Roman Empire was a big goal of many caliphs, to conquer it, to overtake its place in the world. I mean, at one point, the Roman Empire was the preeminent empire. When you thought of empire, you thought of Rome. And so a lot of caliphs, a lot of other states have wanted to overtake that position for a long time, and it can sometimes cause you to overfocus on a particular border. But we can see there's a bit of a stalemate here. I mean, Rome lost an absolutely massive amount of territory to the Caliph, in honestly the earliest days of the Caliph's existence. Since that point, there's been a lot of raids back and forth, a lot of incursions into Roman territory, but they have mostly been able to stand up against the Muslim raids, and it's been more of a stalemate, going back and forth over time.
In 809, news arrived of revolt in Khorasan.
Uh-oh.
It was while traveling east to face down this rebellion that Caliph Harun al-Rashid became sick and died.
Uh-oh.
His 22-year reign would come to be seen as a golden age for the Abbasid Caliphate, a time of prosperity, stability, intellectual and cultural achievement. But al-Rashid's own efforts to ensure a peaceful succession were about to backfire disastrously and plunge the Caliphate back into civil war.
Again?
In the second and final part of Islam's Golden Age, we chart the catastrophe of renewed civil war, the rise of a new caste of slave soldiers, and the devastating onslaught of the Mongols.
Oh, wow. Those are some interesting topics. I really enjoyed this part, and I'm really excited to see part 2. Sounds like some really fascinating stuff. So, we sort of followed chronologically. We looked at the reign of Harun al-Rashid. That was sort of the meat of the video, but we also showed the build-up to that. And then when they talked about the Islamic Golden Age, they sort of broadened out and talked more about the general period. But now, at the end of this video, we've zoomed back in to the immediate succession. Looks like we're dealing with a lot of chaos, civil war, enemies from the outside. I mean, some really fascinating stuff. We've seen some of the stuff we covered in this video in our Kings and Generals reactions, both their early Muslim expansion series, but also their videos on the Islamic Golden Age. But this gave us a little bit more detail, and I think this part 2 that we're going to be getting, I don't know when, that's going to be some stuff that's completely new to me. So I'm real excited to see it. I'm glad we're finally getting a chance to cover the Abbasids. We've been doing the Rashidun Caliphate and the Umayyads for a while now. We're finally moving forward in the history. So, yeah, I really enjoyed this video. There's a lot of great stuff. Epic History TV did a fantastic job, as they always do. If you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked in the description down below, and will give you access to exclusive reaction content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.